My new book, Facts That Aren't True, is out now. Don't forget about my other book, Rational Answers to Stupid Questions. Click the link in the description now.
You brought up like a passage in the Torah where Jacob like births sheep and he uses sticks. He used that as like evidence that the Bible is fallible. Yeah. So I want to challenge you on that a little bit. I don't think I can convince you of God today in one conversation, but I think I can change your mind, at least on that passage.
Okay. So just so like to give people background, it's I believe it's in Genesis. It says, and I believe it's God speaking to them, it says if you carve some sticks so that the sticks have stripes on them and you put it in the feeding or watering troughs of the cattle, I think it was, then that will cause them to have stripes. And that got brought up because I was talking to Voice of Reason, and he said if you find one scientific falsehood or whatever in the Bible, then I think he said he would stop believing. And so like I brought that up and I was like, yeah, that would never happen. And his argument basically was like, no, it doesn't say that is what happens. It just said that did happen. And I was like, okay.
Yeah, so I don't gamble like that and say this would convince me to disbelieve, because I don't know what would necessarily, but yeah.
Fair enough.
Let's just pull up that passage. Let's do a Bible study together. Can't believe I'm doing a Bible study with you. Look at that. We're making progress. Genesis, Jacob breeding sheep. So I don't think God ever talks to Jacob and tells him, hey, if you do this, then this will happen. Jacob, okay, so it's Genesis 30. Genesis 30.
Genesis 30. Okay, 37 through 43. Lou, I got some apples. Lou, you got some too? Lou, I got some apples.
Yeah, so it says...
I got some too.
So the context is Jacob works for his uncle and makes a deal with him, his uncle Laban. He says, hey, if I work for you, give me all of your sheep that you don't want, like the spotted ones, and I'll get to keep them in return for me, like keeping your herds and whatnot. And he's like, all right, deal, because he doesn't really want the spotted sheep. And so what happens was Jacob ends up breeding the spotted sheep. Or no, he ends up breeding all the sheep, but he feeds them like striped sticks, or like he puts striped sticks near the watering trough, so that they start producing more spotted sheep. And then his flock grows to where it's bigger than Laban's flock. I think that's how this works.
I mean, I can just read it real quick. I have it pulled up here.
Okay, cool. Let's do that.
So I'm going to start at verse 35. That same day he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flock. Jacob, however, took fresh-cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees, and made white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs so that they would directly in front of the flock, directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flock were in heat and came to drink, they mated in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streak and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever they were in heat, he would place the branches in front of the troughs, and the animals would mate near the branches. So yeah, it's not like it's. I thought maybe it had to do like change the water or something, but apparently if they just bone in the presence of striped sticks, that has an effect on
Yes.
them. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals, in this way. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks. And there we go.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a little bit different from what you said. It's not like God is giving Jacob this idea. So this is what I think is going on here.
Yeah, it
I
has
think,
nothing to do with God. You're right. He didn't say, do this and this will happen.
yeah, exactly. So what I think is going on here is comedic irony. Like this is supposed to be a comedic episode, even for the people who are writing it, the people who are reading it back then, because this is a pastoral society. Okay. And so like their entire world revolves around like herding sheep and goats. Like they sacrifice sheep and goats to their God and they herd them. Like that's their economy. Okay. And so I don't think you need an understanding of Mendelian genetics to be able to do Punnett squares and all that to know how inheritance works. At least have some rudimentary understanding of how breeding works. And so I think they did know how to breed because there's like some passages in like Leviticus that require a unblemished red heifer to be sacrificed. I don't know the passage, but I know that like in the Levant today, you cannot find unblemished red heifers or red cows. The only place you can find them today is in Texas. There's like this evangelical family that runs a farm in Texas, and they have these unblemished red heifers that they got through selective breeding. And so I think even back then, they had a rudimentary understanding of selective breeding. Like I think that's reasonable to assume. And so what's going on here is like, if you look at the whole story of Genesis, Jacob kind of has a habit of coming up with like these crackpot, like harebrained ways of getting his way. Like he's a con artist basically. Like he conned his brother out of his inheritance, you know? So he's like always scheming, always coming up with like the most ridiculous, overcomplicated plots to get his way. That's like his character. And then it backfires with Rachel. So he wanted to marry her, and then his father-in-law ended up marrying off his other daughter instead, basically conning Jacob out of 7 more years of indentured servitude. But the point is, like, that's his whole character arc. That's his shtick, right? He does this. And the irony here is that even when it's not supposed to work, even when, like, there's no causal connection between striped sticks and goats, even when it shouldn't work, it works. Because for some reason, God likes this guy. And he's so lucky that he can pick the goats that have the recessive gene for striped or speckled, spotted, whatever. He can pick those goats, even though he doesn't know that they're carrying the recessive gene, and breed them. And he's just getting lucky, basically. Like, that's what's going on here. But in his mind, he thinks it's because of the striped sticks. When in reality,
Wait.
he's just a lucky son of a bitch. But
I thought you said it was a joke. Now you're saying God is somehow making him pick out the sheep that don't have stripes but do have the recessive allele for it, and therefore when they breed, sometimes the striped trait comes out.
I'm not saying that God is making him pick the right sheep. I'm just saying he's just getting incredibly lucky every single time.
But it sounded like you were saying God was assisting or intervening in this process. But earlier you said it's a joke, like it's literary irony.
Yeah, comedic irony.
Right. Well, if you're
joke-
going to say it's irony, then it didn't really happen. But now you're saying that it did happen.
Well, the irony in this case is that it shouldn't happen. Like, this shouldn't be working, but it somehow is working. Like, that's where the irony is coming from.
I mean, okay. So my general response to this would be that I think there's, I don't want to say this. The humor just isn't there unless you take this interpretation of it. And you can say, like, well, back then when the story was around, nobody needed to set up the humor because it was all obvious, you know? And it's like, well, I mean, okay, but you know, people have believed in extremely kooky ideas about life for a very, very long time, not even very long ago, like in the 1700s, this idea of spontaneous generation was really popular. There was this guy named Jean-Baptiste van Helmont, and he wrote like recipes on how to spontaneously generate life. He has one that's just, it's so unbelievably stupid. He said if you take a brick out of a wall and put inside the brick some fragrant oils and basil, I remember specifically it was basil, and a few other things, and then put the brick back, that will make scorpions. Now, I don't know what possibly could have led him to that conclusion, because also it's literally impossible that anybody ever did that and scorpions actually did appear behind there. I mean, if it did coincidentally somehow, then that's just like the craziest thing I've ever heard. But like, people were committed to these ideas about where life comes from that just had nothing to do with reality. So I think the idea that having your goats bang in front of some stripes would imprint on them stripes was just completely believable by people back then who were totally ignorant about how anything with regard to that really works. Now, I do appreciate and accept the argument that pastoral people that bred animals kind of knew what would give them good odds of, like, what to do and what not to do with their animals. Like, they had an intuitive statistical kind of idea about that, but I also don't doubt in any way that they would fall for that either, given what we know about other stupid and silly ideas people have believed.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think like the difficulty here is like the interpretation could have changed over time. I'm sure like over the centuries people could have read this text in Israel, because the history of Israel is like happens over the course of thousands of years. So there could have been different times and different places where people read the text and took it literally, and then there could have been times where people took it ironically or read it ironically and saw it for its comedic value. I think though that the case can be made, like a really good case can be made, that the original author, meant this as a joke. Because just before this happens, like in Genesis 30 or Genesis 29, Jacob is scammed out of marrying Rachel. No, wait. Where does he marry Rachel? Oh, yeah, it is Genesis 29. So, like, that episode is comedic. And, like, the whole story of Jacob is comedic. Yeah?
Yeah, but even if I adopt that, I could simply then I could say that this whole thing is supposed to be Jacob being a trickster or whatever, because I could just interpret it as he forfeits all of his striped sheep, but then comes up with this trick that still gives him striped and spotted sheep anyways, and he gets to sit there and go ha 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 ha, like he's the original Loki or something. That interpretation doesn't. I don't see how that interpretation in any way undercuts the fact that it says that doing this literally caused striped sheep and goats or whatever it is. You can still adopt that and still think that these people really, and whoever wrote it, really did think that would or could work.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, it's not like the reading I'm putting forward in any way debunks any other plausible reading. Like, I think it's just as plausible to say that, yeah, like the biblical authors, I think irony could still work in this context, even if they thought it was literal. Only thing I would say to that is, like, this is a pastoral society, and there are like certain laws in the Old Testament where if you want to make a sacrifice, you have to sacrifice an unblemished goat. And if you're a goat herder, that kind of sucks. Like, if you have a flock of goats and you have to sacrifice like 10% of them for the tithe or whatever, that really sucks. So I imagine they had some selective breeding practices, and they would have had more knowledge on it. I guess, like, if I were to make the case stronger, I would need like more external evidence that the Israelites knew how to breed goats. Maybe there are
definitely.
Yeah, I'd have to find like maybe a passage in the Old Testament where it like where some sort of genetic inheritance, some rudimentary understanding is present, especially in Genesis, because that would imply that the writer at least had some understanding of how inheritance usually works. Um, but yeah, that's all I wanted to do, was just to give an alternate account from Voice of Reason, because I think his argument was a little bit bizarre to me. I think he was just saying like, "Oh, it's just a miracle," like when it doesn't seem like that is implied in the text. And I mean, I guess it is sort of a pseudo miracle if you say that Jacob's lucky because God's blessed him. That's not necessarily miraculous, but it is kind of like God's assisting. But
I mean, he's like pulling the switches or whatever. Like, I don't
a
know.
little bit, yeah.
Like a golfer hits the ball and it's this close to being a hole in one, and then God causes an earthquake and the ball falls in. God didn't hit the ball that close to the cup, but he manipulated things so that that outcome still occurred, So,
Yeah. I think that kind of help, divine assistance, if you will, like happens
yeah.
throughout Genesis. Like it doesn't just happen here.